Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 12th of October 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We are going to be joined by live video Skype link by Vanessa Beeley. We were also hoping for David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives, but we seem to have a little bit of a breakdown there at the moment. We will see whether possibly Dave can join us later. Well, what can we say? We'll just comment briefly on the weather because really the news at the moment requires full attention. But we are very pleased to say that we've got sunshine back here in Plymouth, and reports across the country seem to be reasonable. Sun and cloud in Glasgow, so there you are. Well, Mike, we often say war, war and more war, but this seems to be where we're heading with some confusing politics in UK.
Well, this is the first time that we've had Vanessa on the programme since the announcement about the Nobel Peace Prize. So let's talk about this. The Guardian, just to remind everybody, I'm picking on the Guardian in particular here because this was the typical of the coverage just prior to the Peace Prize being given out. The Guardian view on the Nobel Peace Prize, give it to the Syria's white helmets. And as RT pointed out on their coverage on Thursday or Friday last week, quite a lot of the comments on this particular page being removed for some reason, breach of the House rules, whatever that means.
Telling the truth, I think.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Vanessa, the reaction to the fact that the White Helmets didn't get the Peace Prize has been pretty spectacular. We'll go through a little bit of that in a second, but really we've got to be pretty pleased that they didn't get it, first of all, and also pretty pleased at the public reaction, which hopefully we had something to do with generating, which clearly made the press coverage on this was such that it was clear that they were top in the running for this, and for them not to get it, this has got to be seen as a success.
Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary run-up. I mean, I can't remember the last time that we saw a group or an individual receiving such public acclaim from NGOs, from media, from celebrities, from Hollywood, from just about every possible apparatus you can imagine. So, extraordinary promotion of this entity, and equally extraordinary. I mean, leading up to the announcement, I was actually speaking with the real Syria Civil Defense, who were on the night before, Thursday night, were actually incredibly depressed because they were convinced they were going to win this, with the push right at the last minute from the media. But I think what everyone kind of underestimated was the whole truth to power complex. Actually, it's quite nice to call it that. And the public, the tsunami of public opinion, the minute that an article appeared on social media in particular, it was being mobbed. And the comments were coming from all over the world, discrediting the White Helmets. So we saw an extraordinary battle right up to the last minute when, in fact, the Telegraph was even, as you said before, threatening that if the White Helmets didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, then we'd be endorsing Russia. In other words, it's a veiled threat of war, basically, from the Telegraph, which we know to be intrinsically linked with British intelligence. So, it was quite extraordinary, and I think the elation that everybody felt when that announcement went out, and I was speaking directly to the Nobel Peace Prize watchdog, nobelswill.org, and even they just prior were very down in the dumps, kind of thinking, well, this is ridiculous, but we think they're going to win. And then at the last minute, they didn't, and everyone was a little bit sort of shocked, I think. But then the elation came through, and I think what is important and what we need to work with this impetus is that it shows that there is still the ability of the people, the public, to derail these projects. And I think that is what should give us tremendous energy and hope that we can keep doing this.
Well, the other thing that put a wry smile on my face was Radio 4's reaction to it, because they were really asking, well, Colombia's got this, but Colombia hasn't got a peace deal, and they were really, really pretty upset about it. But look, there has been a reaction to this. So before we go and look at the broader political reaction to this, what's the reaction been as far as the White Helmets and the campaigns around the White Helmets? What's their reaction been to this?
Well, their immediate reaction, and the extraordinary thing again, of course, we've seen, throughout the last 5 years, we've seen this incredibly slick process, this marketing process. Every time there is a false flag, we see the Syria campaign and their Manhattan advertising agency that is, connected to them, almost immediately, as if they had one prepared earlier, produce an entire campaign. And this was no different. Almost the second after it was announced that they hadn't won the Nobel Peace Prize, a fundraising campaign was started on behalf of the White Helmets to raise the $1 million prize money that they hadn't won with the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this is an extraordinary, I can't even think how to describe it, fraudulent campaign. It was fraudulent right from the beginning. It was a fraudulent campaign for them to win the Nobel Peace Prize when, in fact, the majority of the time they're calling for war. And now, immediately that they were announced losers, in the sense they didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize despite all the backing they had, we as the public are supposed to compensate them the $1 million that they didn't win.
Yes. Now, of course, we have compensated them the $1 million they didn't win, and $31 more million, because, of course, Boris Johnson announced last week that he was handing over another $32 million, more money coming from other places. And I suppose the big question in our minds at the moment is what is happening to this money? Because it seems to me that if you want to fund a terrorist organization or a group of terrorist organization, a coalition of terrorist organizations, a good way to get the money in would be to hide it under the guise of humanitarianism. So I think we need to start looking at what's happening to this public money, which is being sent via US aid and UK aid into the White Helmets, and what is it actually being spent on?
Absolutely. And actually, somebody sent me something this morning, which shows that the non-humanitarian aid that UK aid is sending, the majority of it, 75%, I think, is going into conflict areas. So this raises a very worrying question. If it's going into conflict areas, then we can recognize that the majority of it will be going to the White Helmets. Then, as you rightly say, what is it being used for? Because the other point that I need to make is on the White Helmet website, they show a very nice infographic of what the money is buying, like fibrillators, like humanitarian equipment. But hold on, rewind a minute, because the real Syria civil defense is being crippled by sanctions that are being imposed by the UK, the EU, and the US against Syria. Are the White Helmets that are supposed to be Syrian, that are heavily promoted as Syrian, are they not included in those sanctions? And if not, why not? And if they are included in those sanctions, where is that money going to? These are the questions that the British public especially should be asking. We have a total now of probably around 65 million that Britain has poured into the White Helmet coffers.
Vanessa, I just add to that. Of course, we should remember it was published in several of the UK mainstream papers, but when the Libya crisis was escalating, we had a report that David Cameron and William Hague had been instrumental in getting a sum. If I remember from the top of my head, I may be wrong, but it was about £234 million was suddenly produced, and they were boasting that this was going to be actually pushed into Libya in notes. So we can see this in other war zones, that you either need to get the weapons in, or you've got to get the money in so that the terrorists can buy the weapons themselves. So I think we're really starting to see the truth coming up to the surface here. And the other thing is that in trying to protect the White Helmets and to shed the crocodile tears that they didn't get the award, we can see how these organisations are being manipulated in order to support them. So an added bonus is we start to see the hidden hand of these non-government organisations collaborating.
And in fact, we're investigating now even deeper because you're quite right. It's almost with each failure in their project, let's say, they're revealing their hand. You know, they revealed it when the Netflix film was attacked. They revealed an awful lot then out of a reaction against a certain failure in their marketing program for that. And now I still believe this was a big failure for them not to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And so what we've seen over the last few days is a lot of revelations, a lot of people coming forward to defend that were not there before. And when we dig a little deeper, we find out exactly who they are, who they're connected to, and it's taking the net even wider. So thank you, guys. You know, you're helping our investigation here.
Okay, well, of course, we do want to find out what's happening with this money. So freedom of information requests into the British government, but you also wanted to highlight Ask the EU, which I suppose is a bit like what do they know, is it?
It's a very important weapon that we have. AskTheEU.org. You can basically address a question to the Secretariat General of the EU, and they have to answer you. It's very easy to register. Just go to the website, register yourself. You'll need an address in the EU. I'm not sure whether Britain still counts.
We still do. We still do.
Okay, so capitalize on it now. And ask the question, ask, you know, exactly, we want some accountability for where this multi-million funding is going. How is it funding 3,000 operatives allegedly on the ground inside Syria, inside terrorist-held areas? The question needs to be asked, and it needs to be asked as many times as possible to the point where they really have to start accounting for this, because none of us really genuinely believe that it's going into humanitarian help. It's, you know, the general idea is that, as you said, as what happened in Libya, this is being funneled into arms, equipment, and training for the terrorists that are inside Syria.
Yes, well, of course, the reaction has become quite broad. So we'll begin with Matthew Rycroft, who is the UK ambassador to the United Nations, and he was speaking after the Russians, who are the currently the president of the United Nations Security Council. I do apologise. So he was speaking at the UNSC last week or a few days ago, and he said, you know, he began by saying, "Normally I begin my statements in this council with the words, 'Thank you, Mr. President.' I cannot do that today." He went on to say, "Your veto today, Mr. President, has only confirmed what we've known for so long. Russia's actions in recent weeks have exposed just how hollow Russia's commitment to the political process is. Today we've seen that commitment for what it really is, a sham. White helmets under direct attack from barrel bombs," this is how he continued, "cluster munitions and incendiary weapons. And that's even before we mention the continued barbaric use of chemical weapons by the regime." So we're sticking with that old chestnut. We continue, "This text that you vetoed was not unreasonable. It called for sensible overdue steps that would have saved lives, starting with the complete end to the bombardment of Aleppo." And he said, "Thanks to your actions today, Antonio Guterres' job," that's the new head of the United Nations, "will be even harder. And worse still, thanks to your actions today, Syrians will continue to lose their lives in Aleppo and beyond to Russian and Syrian bombing. Please stop now." It was an incredible speech that he gave, and possibly only outdone by Boris Johnson yesterday in this emergency motion put forward by Andrew Mitchell MP. And there were a number of real chestnuts came out of this. Of course, he was criticizing the Assad regime. Of course, he was criticizing Russia. But one of the things that he said really early on was that Assad and the Russians are carrying out their actions with the help of Iranian-backed militias. So we're also bringing Iran into this. He's complaining about power and water supplies being cut off. He's saying that a tactic of Assad is to besiege a civilian population. But of course, the question is it a civilian population? You can comment on that in a second, Vanessa. He's worried that eastern Aleppo may be completely destroyed by the end of the year. He's accusing Russia of deliberately targeting hospitals. He's saying that's a war crime. He said that if Putin wants to see Russia as being, a fantastic global player and whatnot, that he actually risks it with his current actions, being his ideas being turned to ashes. Turned to ashes was a pretty strong comment. He did go on to say, in the face of international contempt for what's happening, but the phrase "turned to ashes" I thought was really pretty strong. Of course, he praised the White Helmets in this. He commented on £2.3 billion of aid going into Syria, White Helmets getting their share of it. And of course, the main thrust was for no-fly zones. He said that they had to have innovative ways of getting aid into Aleppo. He said that we had to increase sanctions on Assad and Russia. But then he went on to say there's no commensurate horror, it seems to me, amongst some of those anti-war protest groups. And he said, I'd certainly like to see demonstrations outside the Russian embassy. Where is the Stop the War coalition at the moment? Where are they? Well, actually, Vanessa, that is quite a good question. Where are they? But I mean, they shouldn't really be outside the Russian embassy, it seems to be. If you take Matthew Rycroft's comments and Boris Johnson's comments and some of the other actually quite more extreme comments that were made by other members of parliament yesterday, we are looking at calls for us to start shooting down Russian aircraft. The Stop the War coalition should be out, I think, but not outside the Russian embassies, outside parliament.
No, I mean, we've covered a lot of the Aleppo situation in depth, and I won't sort of go too far into that. But this is horrendous brinkmanship and projectionism going on here, because we know for a fact about power and water supply. West Aleppo, which contains or is giving refuge to 1.5 million civilians, Syrian civilians, the water supply there has regularly been cut off by the terrorists, by the Western-backed terrorists inside East Aleppo. They've either blown up the water pipes, or we know from testimony that we received when we were there, that they actually dumped the bodies that they'd massacred into the River Quick, which then obviously poisoned it. So there have been deliberate attempts by the terrorists to starve, to deprive the Western Aleppo residents of electricity, of clean water, of food. And by the way, we also forget that a few weeks ago, the Eastern terrorists demonstrating under the Nusra, the Al-Qaeda flags, were demonstrating against the UN humanitarian convoys being allowed, and they didn't want the convoys to come into Eastern Aleppo. So, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy, deceit, and lying going on here, downright lying. The hospital situation, I mean, really, it's almost becoming Monty Python-like. The Al-Quds hospital was bombed to the ground in April 2016. Miraculously, now it's rebuilt itself back to its original state, and it's being shown on Channel 4 videos. I mean, this whole, there was a Channel 4 video that I watched last night where you can actually see one of the operatives take a child out of the hospital against his will. He's protesting. They take him outside, they take off his T-shirt, and then they bring him back in as a victim, presumably of chemical weapon attacks. I mean, it's clear, it's on the video, you can watch it. This is sheer theatre and war drama going on here to facilitate further military intervention in Syria, to facilitate the no-fly zone, which we know is the we fly, you don't zone, which is going to, even Clinton has admitted, if the no-fly zone is allowed, goes through, it will mean that more Syrian people will die. So, how much clearer picture do we have that our country or our alliance, the US alliance, is yet again propelling us towards the brink of war? But this war is going to be, it's not going to be the destruction of Iraq or the destruction of Libya. This is going to be a world war fought on Syrian territory.
Well, I'm glad to say that David Ellis has joined us. David, what are your thoughts on this?
All credit to Vanessa and everybody in her net for exposing this propaganda tool that she's come across here with these white helmets. firstly, the ambassador Matthew and Boris are talking of war because they have to. They're having to talk of war because the EU military union is so vital for the EU project to obtain its treasury that it's clear here that it will pretty much do anything in order to get it. The no-fly stuff basically means there's going to be airstrikes, and at that point, if they're going to try and push Russia into a no-fly or airstrike situation, you're right, that is war, and that's then a whole new ballgame. But all our diplomatic machinery in Whitehall is already well along the way to facilitating that. I've got to say, I mean, this is extraordinary from Boris because he's supposed to be a Brexiter, isn't he? And yet he's actually working here at maximum whatever his capability is in order to give birth to the EU military here in this birthing pool out in Syria. So he's completely inverted here on this, because if he doesn't realise that the only outcome from any escalation or continued unrest in Syria is EU military or EU defence forces or whatever they want to call it now, then he's misinformed or he's inept, one or the other. He can't have his cake and eat it on this.
Well, David, in the Telegraph yesterday, we had this article. British troops should play a major role on the ground in Syria, says retired general in exclusive interview. This is General Sir Richard Sheriff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He's saying that government has their heads in the sand. And he's saying that the notion of large-scale occupations by Western troops of Muslim countries is off the radar scale. But what is not off the radar scale is proper capacity building, and by that I mean proper training. Let's be clear, this is going to need an international effort, and arguably the international effort should be led by the most powerful Western democracy of all, which is America. But Britain can certainly play a role in that. To train properly, you've got to be able to commit troops, because the whole principle of training other armies is that you live alongside them, and if necessary, you've got to be prepared to fight alongside them, or at least advise them. It's absolutely the direction of travel we should be going in. You either sit on the sidelines on your hands and say, isn't it terrible, as we see even more ghastly scenes on our TV screens, or we say, we've got to do something about this. And then he goes on to say, however, be under no illusions about how difficult imposing a no-fly zone is. The Syrians have very effective Russian-supplied air defense systems, and that will require a major effort to suppress. But it is quite incredible, the rhetoric from this man. Do you know him, and what are your thoughts on what he's been saying here?
Yeah, we spoke. We've communicated on this subject many years ago of the defence cuts that we've seen here in the UK. I made my feelings known that I viewed that as cuts in order to join EU military union, or as Sir Fallon's now calling it, defence union. Since then, his board at Strategia Worldwide has grown substantially. He's got Peter Hain on there, ex-Labour Defence Minister, and an entourage of big-hitting third sector NGO type people. He's arguing for war. So you could, on the one hand, say that, well, a general would, wouldn't he? Because that's his job. But where I completely disagree with Richard Sheriff's position on this, because what the only outcome of an escalation or interaction or conflict in Syria will be the formation of EU military union, which will be under single point budgetary control from Brussels. So the implication for that upon Her Majesty's Armed Services will be that they no longer have control of their own budgets or policy. So they will but be consumed to be a component within EU military, or a regiment, or a brigade within the EU military. So Britain as a nation will lose control of its military. It's as simple as that. So his course will not bring about, I believe, a sensible solution for Britain as a country, if we wish to stay as a country, or the people. I frankly believe that, put to the people, do they wish to support EU military union? They would say no. So I disagree with any conflict here with Russia. And I certainly don't, I'm not having a bar of any of this propaganda that we're seeing with the white helmets and all the rest of it. So, when you put it all together, you can see the mix of what's actually trying to be achieved, which is support the euro and the eurozone as a currency by obtaining its treasury via obtaining military union. And they're going to use Syria as the birthing pool and talk up how big bad Russia is. So fundamentally, if Russia was so bad, why did we cut through the bone our military in 2010? I'd like an answer from somebody.
Well, David, with a smile on my face, I say, isn't this an interesting question? I couldn't get him into today's news, but one of the local MPs who's been speaking out, calling effectively for war on Russia, is Ben Bradshaw, the very man whose boast was, while he was a reporter with Radio 4, he announced the Berlin Wall coming down. And according to Ben Bradshaw, that was the end of the problem. Those nasty Soviets, the Russians, had gone away. And now suddenly he's squealing because, according to him, some big bad bear has popped out of nowhere. To come back to the military man we've just had on screen, what I pick up is this immensely dangerous rhetoric. He's talking about suppression of Russian ground-to-air weapons. Well, suppression is a very nice term. What it really means is he's got to take those out. That's got to be an overt attack on Russian forces, so nothing nice about that. But he doesn't seem to realise these cuts that have taken place around him. So we have generals, we've got some senior members of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy talking as if Britain still had capable and sizable defence forces, armed services. That is no longer the case, as you say. But what is it with these people? They're living in bunker mentality. They've been reframed, or they're incompetent. I think a lot of it is that basically their mental acumen has been weighed down by the gold braid and the medals, and they no longer can actually think sensibly about what Britain's force levels are. I could say more, I probably won't.
Okay. Right. Now, of course, who is covering this in an honest way? Vanessa, you wanted to highlight Murad Gaziev here.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he's RT sort of really led the charge leading up to the Nobel Peace Prize announcement, in the sense that they had us on crosstalk to discuss the white helmets, and it was a very unusual format, actually, for Peter Lavelle, in a sense that it was more like a panel discussion. And then RT themselves put Murad Gaziev, one of their best reporters, back into Aleppo. And he interviewed the Real Syria Civil Defense. He interviewed the Aleppo Medical Association, you know, very much reiterating the ground we had covered, but it was fantastic to have it on a mainstream platform like RT. And Murad is actually still there right now. He's putting out reports daily, very sort of short, succinct reports, but very chilling ones. One of the recent ones he showed, he went right to the sort of the front lines between West and East Aleppo, where the people are being battered by the Hell cannon, by the gas attacks, which, by the way, are coming from the terrorists in East Aleppo. Nusra Front took over the chemical factory in Aleppo in 2012. And although the factory was destroyed, those ingredients were stolen by Nusra and have been distributed along with additional ingredients that came in from Turkey to the terrorist factions in and around Aleppo and Idlib. So the chemical attacks are coming, and they're well documented that they're coming from the terrorist areas into the civilian areas, not only in western Aleppo city, but in the surrounding countryside also, in Al-Zara, in Nubal, and places like that. And so Murad is doing a great job of demonstrating exactly what is going on there. He shot yesterday where he said, okay, let's have a look at the flags that are flying over East Aleppo, where we're being told that this is only moderate rebels and civilians. And they zoomed in with the camera, and the only flags that you see are Nusra and ISIS, the black flags. And this is being reiterated again by people living in West Aleppo. There's a young Frenchman, Pierre Lecourf, who's working as a volunteer right on the front lines again. And he said the same thing on Sunday Wire on Sunday night. He said, listen, the only flags that you see are black flags, which are Nusra or ISIS. So, you know, this in itself just makes a mockery of the narrative that's coming out of British government or Western media but particularly from the UK government and the US government.
Just before we move on from this, this might be a difficult question to ask, and I'm kind of hijacking it a little bit here, but why do you think the Russians aren't making more of the white helmets situation and trying to use that for a bit of political capital themselves?
I think, Dr. Al-Jafri, the Syrian permanent representative at the UN in New York, actually did expose them the other day. I don't know if you saw that, when all of our incredibly professional diplomats walked out just before he started speaking. They missed out on the interesting part, which was where he exposed James Le Mesurier, the British mercenary trainer, military trainer, just recently given the OBE in June 2016, who is British intelligence training, military intelligence training, the White Helmets. And this is a very important point to make. We're talking about the EU army here. You have a top operative here. James Le Mesurier is somebody that has incredibly strong ties to the majority of the high-profile private security firms like Blackwater, which is now Academy, Constellus Group, Good Harbor International, which is Richard Clarke, Bush's terror advisor. You have a guy here who's really top flight operative, and he is in charge of the training of a humanitarian NGO. I don't think he's training them on humanitarian issues. I think he's training them militarily. So you already have the EU army inside Syria under the guise of the White Helmets. And if you look at the RAND paper on the new form of warfare, which is swarming, this perfectly coincides with that. It's small military groups, specially trained, being deposited into strategic areas inside a target nation. That's exactly what you have with the White Helmets. But not only the White Helmets, if you look at Israel's involvement in the Golan Heights, the same thing. Al-Qaeda operatives there are operating on behalf of Israel as the swarming army. They're taking up positions in specific areas in the Golan Heights, and they're defending them on behalf of Israel. In the north, you have the same thing with so-called Free Idlib Army, it's now called, which consists of three groups that are the most heavily funded by the CIA and equipped with probably the most sophisticated weaponry and missiles.
I'm sorry, Vanessa, we heard today that they are hoovering up so-called defectors from ISIS at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. This is part of the plan, and we're seeing a very, the war is being staged. The no-fly zone is just the next step, but the forces are on the ground. They've been on the ground for some time now, certainly since 2013, when the White Helmets started to be formed.
Yeah.
Vanessa, that appears to be very accurate analysis to me. And of course, if you're going to have these swarming groups, if you're going to use people under the guise of aid, you need the professionals in behind them. I put out a tweet yesterday, which was to remind people, of course, that British Special Forces have been on the ground in Syria for some time. I pointed out that former Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron had lied to the British nation yet again, because, of course, what was he saying? No troops on the ground. We then discover, with the help of the BBC, that obviously there's a significant presence of British Special Forces. And what will they have been doing? They will have been working to train, communicate and coordinate with these groups which are acting with the terrorists. So we've got senior elements of the British military being used to put this together, and it's been done under our very noses, so not reported by the mainstream press till the last moment, but now we can see with the advantage of hindsight. I'll just bring in this one. This was a report from Press TV. Now, this story came out of a Canadian journalist, apparently, but he had taken photographs of American warplanes. The bottom right one is a genuine Russian aircraft, but the others are American warplanes, but painted out very much in colours to mimic the Russian aircraft. Now, they were saying, is this a conspiracy? Are these aircraft to be used in Syria, or in the Syrian theatre at least? I say, well, that is possible, but of course, the Americans have used aircraft in Russian colour schemes for training for many years, so we have to be a little bit careful on what's going on here, but this may indicate something untoward. We just remind our viewers and listeners, Mike covered this a couple of days ago, but it was the Russian Defense Ministry, a gentleman called Igor Kanashenkov, and he was talking about hotheads. And he said he drew attention of hotheads that after a strike on Syrian troops by planes of the coalition on September 17, we've taken all necessary measures to rule out any such mistakes against Russian military and military facilities. And there is the equipment on screen, the S-400 missile systems, which the Russians have now brought in. They are not messing around. Well, this is the key point, because the Duran at least is asking, has there been a reaction? So we have Josh Earnest, the White House spokesman, at a press briefing said this: the president has discussed in some details why military action against the Assad regime to try to address the situation in Aleppo is unlikely to accomplish the goals that many envisaged now in terms of reducing the violence there. It is much more likely to lead to a bunch of unintended consequences that are clearly not in our national interest. Now, the point of the article is saying this seems to be America suddenly getting very cold feet now that the Russians have basically said, well, we've now put the equipment we need in position, and if you want to try it, we're ready for you. Interesting to watch this video clip, which you can find through that website, because at the start of this major press briefing, Mr. Earnest does not look at his journalistic audience. He delivers it looking down, as you can see with the screenshot I've got. And he goes on to say this: I'm not going to take any options off the table. I'm not going to be in a position of taking options off the table for the Commander-in-Chief. And that was his response when people said, well, what does that mean? He didn't really want to go there. But I would say this was a particularly sheepish press briefing. And I'm just going to throw this one in as a little oddball before I hand over. We just remind people that our very own Peter Mandelson was in the press a while back because he was busy profiting from Sistema, a large Russian conglomerate. He thought the pay there was about £200,000 a year plus a share of the profits. And it's a defence technology company. So have we got senior British politicians in the background
playing both sides of the argument?
Playing both sides off against each other, and they're going to benefit with profit. David, I'll let you comment on that, and maybe Vanessa would like to follow.
Well, isn't that the nature of our sort of situation? He's playing, perpetrating on the one hand and playing on the other. It's so blatant now. It's just the only difficulty is getting enough people alerted and getting the message and the truth out there. Just picking up on what Vanessa said there, because it was something that come across our net a couple of weeks ago, which was the RAND Corporation commenting on EU military and the situation in Syria. Now, anybody that doesn't understand, the RAND Corporation are the premier big-hitting organisation that backs up policy and policy direction in the US and in the UK. They are a customer of Her Majesty's. Her Majesty's government is a customer of which way round would it be? Are they a customer or are we a customer? And one way or the other, they're intertwined. And if they're commenting on this, make no bones about it, the die's already been struck. So it's an interesting game of chess that's now out there as to whether they'll achieve their tipping point of getting their military and their treasury and precipitating with their plan and their tactic and their currency, or whether they're going to get a blood nose from Russia. Now, I mean, one thing that's probably going to come across at some stage is, we're all going to get accused of being Russian sympathisers. We're not. What we're saying is this is the situation. You make your own mind up. And this situation, if it carries on like it is, and I'll agree with General Peter Zwack on this, if it carries on, it's inherently dangerous. Something at some stage is going to go pop, and we're all going to end up having to cover ourselves in factor 3 million suntan cream. That's where we're going, and it's not good.
Indeed. Well, of course, the other conflict that's going on at the moment is Yemen. Saudi Arabia under still a huge amount of pressure following this particular event on Saturday, the bombing of the funeral, 140 people killed or so. Tobias Ellwood, if you remember, we said had been concerned about that on Monday. He was very concerned. He was so concerned he made a phone call to the Saudis on Monday night. But apparently he was sitting beside Boris yesterday during the speech in Parliament, but apparently he's had to go scuttling off to Saudi today because the pressure continues to build. On Monday, he said, "We urge all sides to recommit to political talks and to implement a cessation of hostilities." And I'm suggesting that what he was really saying was, in the meantime, Saudi Arabia is a valued customer for British arms and munitions, so he's scuttled off over there to deal with that issue. And of course, BAE Systems did issue a statement saying that discussions between BAE Systems, the UK government, and Saudi Arabia are progressing. We're working to define the scope and terms of the next 5-year Saudi-British Defence Cooperation Programme. I'm going to ask both for comment, but Vanessa, beginning with you, what's your take on the sort of response to what Saudi did at the weekend? Is there traction being gained against this whole Yemeni business at the moment?
Traction being gained in the sense of ending the war of aggression?
Exactly, because even the BBC is forced to admit that most of the civilian casualties are being caused by the Saudis.
Well, that's really good of them, 18 months into
Yes.
into a genocide. No, I mean, fundamentally, no. You know, we're not saying. I see it very much that in the case of two illegal terrorist states, which are Israel and Saudi Arabia, they are allowed to kill with impunity purely and simply because of the UK and US and EU interests, which boils down to the military-industrial complex. And with Israel, obviously, they are the US military base inside the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia is producing the terrorist army that they need to overwhelm Syria. So, you know, their interests are so interconnected. Plus, then we have the energy and geopolitical interests that the States and the UK and EU have inside Yemen, which are the gas and oil resources that are there. So no, I don't see how we're not seeing any outrage. I mean, we see more outrage over alleged false flag human rights violations inside Syria than we've seen over a true human rights violation on a regular basis. But you know, on Saturday, the death toll, by the way, is mounted to well over 400. That, in all honesty, will probably be well over 700. I was speaking to people there yesterday, purely because those that were injured are bleeding to death on the streets because of the UN genocidal sanctions that have been imposed on 27 million Yemenis illegally, based on Resolution 2216, which is totally founded on the context or the pretext of the legitimacy of Mansour Hadi, ex-President Mansour Hadi, who had resigned twice before he fled to Riyadh to encourage them to bomb his own people to reinstate him after he had resigned. We also, I mean, a very important point to make here is that why this happened, why I believe this happened, is because Yemeni to Yemeni dialogue has been ongoing. And the Yemeni people and the Yemeni parliament quorum had voted to create the political council, which is a legitimate government under Yemeni constitutional laws. And it received the support of millions. This was not some Photoshop shot that was used in Syria. This was genuine. Millions of people went on the streets of Sana'a, the capital, to support the political council that is a coalition between Ali Abdullah Saleh and Ansarullah. This is an official government. The UK government is making the statement that they do not recognize this government and that they are forcing the Yemenis to go back down the route of negotiation with the UN that is already imposing genocidal sanctions on these people. 10,000 Yemeni children have died of treatable diseases because the UN is enforcing sanctions that should only be against 5 named individuals, but instead is being used against 27 million Yemeni people. I mean, this is one of the most supreme crimes of our age, that what is happening in Yemen.
Just before we ask David for comment, is there any news or any indication yet of how many Yemeni government officials were killed in that? Because it was obviously related, a relative of one of them that was being buried. Is there any news about if any of the senior so-called Houthi individuals were affected by it? Vanessa?
I'm not actually aware of any government officials that were killed in that. I could be wrong. It's not something I've actually investigated yet, but I will have a look at it.
Yeah.
But it was way more. You're right. It was a funeral of a former politician. But the majority of the deaths were civilians, and the majority of the injuries were civilians. And of course, it was the Saudi double tap. They bombed once, and then when people rushed to try and rescue their relatives, their families, their friends, they bombed again. And so, this was a callous massacre of civilians inside Sana'a. And I was told it was actually in retaliation for the fact that the Yemeni forces, the Ansarullah forces, had a few days previously killed various Saudi commanders and mercenaries in Marib province in Yemen. So, of course, the Saudi reaction, which is exactly the same as the Israeli reaction, is to immediately target civilians in a revenge killing. But we also have to remember that our military advisors, the UK and the US, our military advisors are in the control and command center in Riyadh, dictating the target. So I don't accept that the British government is unaware of which targets Saudi Arabia is hitting with the bombs that we are supplying and the States are supplying.
Which is exactly the point you made the other day.
Yep.
Shall we?
We'll just move on. We have an eye on the time, so we'll just carry on through. A key point that's come out in our news today is that people can make a big difference the moment that they speak up, the moment they start talking to other people. The truth spreads. Exposure of what's happening is key. So we'd like to say we're getting a very good response at the moment with setting up new groups around the British Constitution group. We've got another rule of law forum coming up here in Totnes. This is obviously a local one for Devon, but we can go further afield because there's a network also forming. This is for Shropshire, Telford area. So if you're listening or watching us today from that location, we'd like to hear more from you. What is our aim? Our aim is, of course, to push out the truth, help educate people and get people to stand up for themselves in the right way, because we can make a difference. And we are saying ultimately, of course, that there is now a total breakdown of law and order in the United Kingdom. We're seeing that with these unlawful wars overseas, but at home we're seeing it everything from people dying in police cells or having the windscreen of their car smashed in, or indeed children simply stolen from parents by the state. So the 19th of November for that event.
We should just mention that both Vanessa and David will be there.
Indeed.
Speaking.
As speakers, both Vanessa Beeley and David Ellis will be at that British Constitution event. So if you'd like to hear them speak live and possibly meet them in person, then that Winchester event is one you should go to. And we're just going to push the little mantra here that a lot of people are becoming anxious at what they see going on around them. And we say there's one way to conquer fear, and that's to start doing something. Action conquers fear. So if you don't know what to do, start to join in with the networks.
Right, we're just going to end on this one, and this is really for David to comment on, because I thought this was spectacular, because the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh have been awarded long service and good conduct medals. This is as a result of changes that Michael Fallon has made, which now recognise the good conduct of armed forces personnel who have over 15 years experience and no blemishes on their records, apparently. So under the new rules, all serving personnel with 15 years of service get the Long Service Award, and of course they probably get the Good Conduct Award as well. And the Queen received these 3 medals, one each for the Royal Navy, Army and the Royal Air Force, in her capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, which she has held since she took the throne in 1952. And the Duke of Edinburgh received a Royal Navy Long Service and a Good Conduct Medal with 6 bars on the ribbon in recognition of 75 years of service, apparently. So there you go, David. We are giving gongs to the most appropriate people in the country who have, of course, upheld the Constitution religiously and deserve everything they get.
I'm as staggered with this. I didn't know about this. I'm as staggered with this as what I am of seeing all the heads of service on Twitter now. And one former admiral said to me that was facile. So I really don't know what to say about this with the Queen and the Duke of Ed getting themselves medals. I mean, I mean, the only thing I can say is will we have, if this is the case, will we have Her Majesty's Armed Services, the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, Royal Air Force, and the British Army this time next year?
Yes, good question.
And if I may, I'll just add to that I regard this as an utter insult on the armed forces, because a lot of very good men and women work extremely hard over their 15 years service in order to receive a medal and a thank you. And I just look at the photograph of these people snickering and sneering as though this is some sort of toy. So I think this is one of the biggest insults that I have ever seen on serving men and women in our armed forces. I can actually say it sickens me.
David?
Yeah, well, if we're going to be dishing medals out, is Tony Blair and David Cameron, are they going to get medals for the new improved hybrid warfare that doesn't require any parliamentary scrutiny or debate or votes? So are we going to have a new medal for them as well?
I think we have got a medal in mind, but we'll probably have to wait to
it's made of rope.
Forthcoming programme to discuss that and how it will be awarded.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I think that brings us to close today. Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us, and similarly for your good self, David. What remarkable times we live in. What can we do? We need to continue pushing out information and the truth as we see it. And then it's up to good men and women in the United Kingdom and overseas to act upon it. And I'll end by saying we really do need your support. If you're not already a subscriber to UK Column, or you haven't made a donation to us and you're watching, we can only do this with your ongoing support. What we'd like to see is a lot more people making a regular subscription of a relatively small amount. Than what tends to happen is that we have peaks and troughs where somebody is very generous. It would be so much nicer if we could have a lot of people making a small contribution, which gives stability and ultimately would help us to expand the work that we're doing here. I think that's the best way I could put it. But thank you, all of you who are contributing to UK Column at the moment. Thank you for your support, and we'll continue. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.